Marta, thank you so much for joining us today here after your panel at the ULI Fall Meeting. It was packed, by the way.
It was.
Standing room only. I know because I was standing. Tons of really amazing information there. So first, will you tell us about the work that you do at ULI, and then we'll dive into the panel.
Absolutely. So ULI, Urban Land Institute, we unlike a lot of other industry groups, we don't lobby. And so because of that, we put a lot more emphasis on thought leadership. And so our content team is massive. And within that content team is our sustainability team, where we have upwards of 20 staff looking at everything across the sustainability board, from decarbonization to resilience to health and social equity. And it's all rooted in the business case. So we are looking at the business case for sustainability in real estate.
Yeah, I think I like the approach there, right? It's not just about the academic side of it. It's what is the actual hands-on impact of that, and how can people use that information to make better decisions.
Absolutely.
Which is fantastic.
And, we've got a pretty wide audience in terms of the membership of ULI. Some folks very early on their sustainability journey, some who are just bleeding edge and doing the most innovative app projects and activities possible. And so we also make sure that our content is relevant across the board, whether you're just starting out and need to figure out the 101 on what to do for sustainability, or those who really want to push the envelope and figure out what's next.
Yeah. And so panel now, excuse me, so your panel this time was about financing decarbonization. First, let's maybe start with, what is decarbonization?
Decarbonization is the idea of reducing carbon emissions in the built environment, decarbonizing.
That's pretty simple.
That's my simplest definition I can give.
Perfect. And then the financing of it obviously is a huge question, right? And where across the capital stack pays for it effectively, right? Is a developer, and this was one of the things you talked about in the panel, is a developer accepting a slightly lower IRR? Are the banks going to offer
reduced basis
points, right?
And other times, folks are just funding it with their own internal capital, because that's their business as usual nowadays.
Yeah, and so I think one of the conversations that we just had, again, real estate is a for-profit enterprise.
Yes.
Right. Everything comes down to what's my net return on this in this
the bottom
investment.
line.
And so, what are some of the different? We mentioned a couple of them there, but what are some of the different programs out there that you're seeing, or maybe some of the newer emerging programs that are coming out there to change this? I'm going to bite the bullet and invest today for some future potential return, to making that an easier decision to make today, right? I mean, I think that seems like that's such a big leap of faith. We don't know yet what the downstream returns of these investments are going to be necessarily. So how do you make that decision today?
Right. And well, also because the upfront cost for sustainability is sometimes higher.
Right.
When you're thinking about decarbonizing an asset and the additional technology investment upfront, how do you make sure that the returns on that do come through in the end? There are a couple of different financing vehicles that we're seeing real estate firms look into to help address this. One of them is green loans. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, for example, have multifamily loans where if you reduce your energy and water use about 30% beyond code, then they give you reduced basis points on a loan. It's straight up. It's quite simple. And the uptake for those programs has been really strong. And so we're starting to see more of those green loans come out where institutions are offering funds at a reduced basis points to see that improved performance on the sustainability side. So that's one thing we're seeing.
And that's a now effect,
that's
right? That's a now impact.
We're also starting to see more issuances of green bonds. And this is the idea that a real estate company will, issue a green bond for $500,000 or something. And, inevitably, it is almost always oversubscribed because the appetite from the investor market is so high to invest in these green bonds and other vehicles that are tied to ESG. And then those funds are used in anything in their real estate portfolio related to green buildings. That could be developing a LEED certified building, upgrading an existing facility to net zero, installing renewables. It is a pretty widespread of what can be included in that. But you also tend to get a better cost of capital for those green bonds than you would for a traditional bond from the market. And so that's another thing that we're seeing real estate firms do to work to decarbonize at scale, as opposed to one building at a time, like really going big.
And that also seems like a now impact, right? How else are you seeing developers price this in, right? I mean, I think, and that's one of the things that we've seen in our industry is trying to price in the ESG aspect of it, right? And there isn't really necessarily a dollar for dollar calculation that you can run. And so is it more of just a will, like we have to will this into being and we'll see what the downstream effects are? Or how are you seeing people actually start to put some calculated financials around these initiatives?
It's a great question, because we're seeing a lot of anecdotal evidence that these green funds and these green buildings and this decarbonized future really does pay out and really does have those returns that the folks are looking for. But we're not seeing the numbers as often as we would like. It's very hard to show the quantifiable green premium, especially for a merchant developer or someone who really doesn't hold that asset they developed for a long time. If you do hold it for a long time, those operational savings are just tremendous. And so the value is there. You reduce your operating costs, you increase your net operating income, throw a cap rate on there, you increase your asset value.
Yep.
And that, very proven, very wonderful. But for those quick develop and sell type of examples, that is still a little tricky to establish for certain. But we're starting to see some qualitative cases of how this is happening more and more. We're starting to see buildings lease up faster when they're green or have this decarbonized net zero future. We're starting to see investors seek specifically green buildings to purchase and acquire and invest. A lot of companies are incorporating ESG or carbon sustainability in their due diligence process when they're thinking about acquiring a property. And on the flip side, they're also thinking about it for their exit strategy. All right, how am I going to handle ESG? What data do I need to include? How do I position this property just right for exit? Because they know that whoever's going to buy the property, X number of years down the line, is going to care about that even more than folks care about it today. And so they're kind of planning ahead in that way. Notice I didn't give you any numbers, and I wish I could. But we continue watching the market, and we're hopeful that over time those numbers will come to fruition in a more obvious way.
And I think the term that was used in the panel was the greenium.
Greenium,
the greenium,
yes.
which I think is a great term.
Who needs a green premium when you have the greenium?
Yeah. But I think what you mentioned there too is looking at the future buyers, right? And then when you think about the cost to retrofit versus the efficiencies that you can build on a ground up, right? So I guess, again, hard to put numbers around it, but just as a concept, certainly seems like there's concern of if you're not doing that today, the next buyer is either going to pass because it's not up to a certain standard, or they're going to underwrite the cost to retrofit, right? Which is likely going to be more expensive 5-10 years from now in the future than you can do it today. So I think that's, again, hard to quantify, but that's maybe where that mentality just has to be. Like, we have to will this to happen today on, taking some betting on the come there for that.
Yes. And the savvy real estate leaders are already thinking about this. We're calling it transition risk when it comes to climate. The idea that, it's not physical climate risk where will the building flood, which should also be incorporated. We're just talking carbon right now. It's this transition risk concept where the regulatory and economic factors of sustainability are going to result in your building being stranded because it's financially obsolete.
Right.
And so that's what you were getting at with this idea that over time, if tenants don't want to lease the space, if owners don't want to buy the property, if investors don't want to invest in the fund anymore, like you're in trouble. And so planning ahead for that and getting in front of it gives folks a real competitive advantage.
And so now net zero is a concept that's been thrown around for as long as I think we can probably remember.
Great.
What does that actually mean?
Net zero is the concept of a building that is completely powered by renewable energy. So it ends up being that any of the energy used is green and ends up with no carbon emissions, net zero carbon.
And so that's on a operational basis.
On an
and that was,
operational
again, something that was brought up, I think, as a question from the panel was, are we talking about the embedded carbon in the construction and in the products itself versus the operations? And so when you say net zero, is that from the...
So Adam, net zero has many different definitions across the buildings industry right now. So you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different definitions of net zero. And there are plenty of organizations trying to give a standard definition. ASHRAE is working on one, NBI, the New Buildings Institute. All sorts of organizations are working to standardize exactly what net zero is. In my perspective, it matters that we're moving forward, and that
any improvement's an improvement.
Any improvement's an improvement. And so when we think about real estate's journey to net zero, what we see included in that is energy efficiency, making an asset or a portfolio as energy efficient as possible first, then thinking about on-site renewable energy, thinking about electrification and grid interactivity so that all power can be green from that renewable electric future grid, and then the residual emissions that would be offset by renewable energy credits or carbon offsets or otherwise. And so that's the carbon operations piece, as you mentioned. And then we start thinking about embodied carbon, and that's the carbon emissions associated with the upfront building materials creation and construction itself. Concrete and steel are the two biggest offenders when it comes to embodied carbon, and it's very much on our radar. We're talking about it, we're looking at it. And right now, when we're talking about net zero, we generally lean toward just looking at operations because that is a bit more actionable for our members at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, again, anytime you're trying to incentivize change, having quick measurable wins, right, that goes a huge way in kind of changing the behavior. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Granted, embodied carbon, I really don't want to diminish its importance, though, because when you look at the life cycle carbon emissions of a building, half the life cycle carbon emissions of a building are from the embodied carbon of the upfront materials. So it's a significant consideration when it comes to any sort of building development, design, and construction. And we're working to help our members address that as well.
And on that front, I guess, am I wrong in thinking that the embodied carbon issue is only for new construction? I mean, how can you disembody carbon from existing structures that carbon's already been put in the equation, right?
So it's embodied carbon is unfortunately not just something to look at the beginning. That would really simplify
we're
it.
on Halloween time, so I can say disembodied carbon. Is that a thing? I don't know if that's a thing.
Can I talk about vampire loads too? Because I always love making those jokes. For embodied carbon, we disembodied. That's funny. There is the upfront embodied carbon of the building, really structural materials to get that in place. But then we think about fit outs. Every time a new office tenant comes in, every time you redo the interiors of a hotel room or a multifamily apartment or otherwise, all of the materials that go into that process add up over the life cycle of a building as well. So we need to think about building interiors and the embodied carbon of those fit outs over the life cycle of the building, in addition to the structural upfront embodied carbon of the building materials themselves.
Okay. How about vampire loads?
Thank you. So when it comes to energy efficiency and energy use in a building, plug and process loads, like all the appliances you plug in, they're often called vampire loads because even when they're off, they still suck power.
Draw some power,
They still draw and suck, as a vampire might, some power from the outlet. And so there are all sorts of ways that the efficiency community is trying to encourage building occupants to reduce their plug and process load, or these vampire loads, some might say. Spooky, right?
Very
scary.
Very appropriate.
Watch out. The vampire loads are sucking all of your power. But as buildings become more efficient on lighting and HVAC and those type of typically larger loads, plug and process loads, or the vampire load type of pieces, are becoming a larger piece of the pie that need to be addressed.
Perfect.
So it's a bit of a tangent, but vampire loads, watch out.
We'll watch out. So what are you excited about in terms of where this whole industry and conversation is going?
I'm excited about a lot of things. I will say one of the things I'm excited about most is integration with the utility grid. And that's a piece of the puzzle that is going to help balance those future brownouts and blackouts with supply and demand challenges from the utilities. But it's also going to help buildings as they become more innovative and as they become more smart with Internet of Things and smart technology, optimized operations, where they can go back and forth with the grid with distributed energy resources like batteries on site, solar panels, to optimize their carbon emissions and optimize their costs in an incredibly sophisticated way. I am so excited about the potential here because not only does it alleviate the stress on the utility grid, it also improves the asset, the building itself. And then you start thinking about the electric vehicle boom that's going to come in and all of the charging strategies there. And the potential is immense. And I just get really excited about that.
And that's a very complex problem that requires a lot of interconnected parties to all kind of get on the same page, right?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
It's not easy, but it's something that's a couple years from now, everyone's going to be thinking about how do we get our building to be more grid interactive? How do we do it in an efficient way? How do we do it in a low carbon way? How do we get our utility on board? It's going to be really interesting.
Great. Well, let our listeners know how they can learn more about these kinds of things and the work that ULI is doing.
Go to ULI's website, knowledge.uli.org, and look for any of the information that we have around sustainability. We also have a compendium of all of our net zero related resources at uli.org/net zero. So check it out.
Fantastic. And we'll have links in the show notes for all those resources. And Marta, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for spending some time with us here at the Fall Conference. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you do with ULI?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having me. So I am Vice President of ULI's Urban Resilience Program, and that program helps our buildings, our communities, and our cities be better prepared for the impacts of climate change. So that is, of course, catastrophic events, wildfires, hurricanes, but also slower moving, more stealth disasters like drought and warming temperatures. And something I want to emphasize here is that a central goal of our program is not just ensuring that efforts to enhance resilience reduce vulnerability. That's, of course, a good thing. But we also want to strengthen cities overall. And that means enhancing environmental performance, economic opportunity, and social equity.
And so resilience isn't necessarily just about the physical properties itself. There's more of a fabric of resilience, whether it's at the community level, state level. So it goes beyond just the resilience that we think of in like a material property perspective.
Well, and I think it speaks to the underlying opportunity of resilience, right? We always think of it as just risk reduction, which it is. It's critically important to reduce that risk, but reducing risk is only beneficial if that disaster actually occurs. And where we begin to layer in these other opportunities, that suddenly makes resilience beneficial 365 days a year.
So tell us about the panel that you were on, Demystifying Climate Preparedness, How to Prepare Buildings and Cities to Weather Climate Change. Who was on that panel? What did you guys talk about?
That was a fantastic panel. I was so thrilled to be asked to moderate that panel by Gensler, who organized it. They had a great lineup. We had speakers from Gensler and from Arup, as well as from Skanska, looking at the full spectrum of disaster preparedness and resilience and how our buildings and communities can better prepare. And that looks at the economy, equity, the overall city experience, right? It's not just where we are, it's how we live in our spaces, as well as the environment and how those themes cross-cut to create those multiple benefits.
And so we're here in Dallas, recording this at the fall meeting. Texas has seen a ton of growth, right, and also has its share of issues with some climate change circumstances that are happening. So what conversations are you having here at the fall meeting, just in general, to come up with some solutions for some of these challenges that the local environment here is facing, but broadly, in other locations as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So two of the main ones we've been speaking about today are drought and wildfire. Those are interrelated hazards. They're certainly not the only hazards that Dallas face, but given we're only here for a week, we decided to focus in a little bit.
Too about wildfires, so I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, believe it or not, when we look at the highest wildfire risk in the country, Texas is second only to California.
Really?
So it's important that we talk about it here.
Yeah.
And we did that at the Building Healthy Places Forum here as part of our fall meeting. We did a deep dive into the health of our forests, how that contributes to wildfire risk, and how we can better manage our natural resources to reduce risk and maximize the benefits of our natural systems, which has a wonderful co-benefit of also improving value. The value can be improved, for example, in Flagstaff, Arizona. In our fire break report, we found that home buyers were willing to pay more for homes that were near proactively managed forests.
And now, again, I wouldn't intuitively think that Texas is a high wildfire likelihood state. Are there other I guess, surprises, or are there interesting areas that maybe you wouldn't intuitively think are a climate risk for certain areas? What have you found in some of the research?
Yeah, so we have a report called Firebreak, Wildfire Strategies for Resilience. I'll give you that for the show notes. But when you look in that report, there's a page that shows a map of the United States, and there are other surprise areas. Florida, for example, is a high wildfire risk state, but they have also been proactive in managing their forests and reducing that risk.
Interesting. And so how, I think, again, one of the common themes that we're discussing here is it seems like there's a very long-term look at how we address some of these things, but it's a now issue, right? So what are some of the more proactive steps people can be taking today, whether that's conversations like this, getting more educated and more aware of some of these challenges? What are some of the more effective now solutions that people can be exploring?
Yeah, that's a great question. Climate change is now. It's not a future issue.
Yeah.
I mentioned drought as one of the other things we've been talking about while we're here in Texas. And that's an easy one to begin to address, because one of the most cost-effective ways to address drought is simply to conserve water. And we're already seeing that consumers have an increasing preference for water-efficient fixtures and appliances, as well as buildings and landscapes.
Yeah. And now we had Elena from LaSalle yesterday come on and talk as well about her panel and the report that LaSalle co-sponsored with ULI. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, insights from that report, challenges that we're seeing, and how real estate professionals, both owners, operators, developers, even users of space, can start thinking about some of these different impacts.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, good data leads to better decision making. And that's a really simple statement, but we can't price climate risk, we can't mitigate climate risk if we don't first understand our level of risk. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of transparency out there when it comes to some of the climate risk assessment analytics software that we have. Everyone does things just a little bit differently, and that was really the focus of the report that we did with LaSalle. There's a study mentioned in the report of how we compare 3 different providers, so climate risk software providers, with a slew of different addresses. And for every address, each provider had a different answer, which is so
That's
frustrating.
hard to make informed decisions
you can't
when
make
there's
a
no
decision when there's
consistency.
no consistency, and especially with such a wide variation. You know, one thing would be a low risk, another thing would be a very high risk.
Yeah.
You know, it's not even close. So the report began to examine why this variation is occurring. For example, there could be differences in the emission scenario that the software provider uses, right? Are we optimistic? Maybe it's just a 4.5 RCP. Maybe we're a little less optimistic and it's RCP 8.5.
And can you take a minute, RCP?
So RCPs are just emission scenarios. It's representative concentration pathway.
Okay.
It's a scientific term. Really, everyone can just think of it as either a low emission scenario or a high emission scenario.
Okay.
And that's just one example of one of the things that can be different about these providers. They might also have different hazards that they consider. They might have different timeframes, right? Climate risk in 5 years is going to look a lot different than climate risk in 20 years. So that, again, can contribute to this variation. But what I think is really helpful about the report is they offered a framework, right? How can we begin to navigate what we have today? Because yes, our goal is to add some transparency and some standardization, but we have to act now. We have to decide what we're going to do, given the fact that climate risk is not a future problem. And so some of the steps that we offered is to have you think about whether or not your provider meets your strategic objectives, right? Are you trying to report to SFDR, TCFD? Are you considering which hazards are most important to your portfolio? You might also think about those RCPs, the timelines of emissions, and what we think is going to be most strategic to the firm that's needing the input from the climate risk provider. And then the other piece that I'm sure Elena touched on is value at risk. And value at risk is touchy. We don't have a true definition for what value at risk or climate value at risk is. Everyone has different inputs, and we need to standardize those inputs so that we can truly make those comparisons.
And so another part of the conversation that I've heard multiple times here at the meeting is around insurance coverage. Obviously very difficult to forecast how that's going to play into these decisions, but that's a huge part of how to protect and maybe not necessarily from a physical resiliency perspective, but from a capital resiliency perspective, insurance plays a pretty big piece of that. So what are you seeing from the perspective of either the insurers, if you have any insights there, or as owners, how they're trying to mitigate against these unknowns in insurance, or any interesting innovations in that area of the market?
Sure. Yeah, insurance is a challenge. Insurance, from a risk signaling perspective, is only a 1-year time frame. They're not looking 5 or 10 years out, and that doesn't always in line with a hold period. So it is an indicator, but it can't be your only indicator. But our insurers are also recognizing that it's expensive to continue to have to pay out claims after these major disasters that are increasing in frequency and intensity. And so they are trying to incentivize in their own way building in a more resilient manner. A couple examples. The Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety for years has had a fortified program. It's for single family homes, commercial businesses, and now multifamily as well. And that can actually be legislated at the state level so that insurers are required to give discounts for the buildings that meet these above code standards. Other insurers like FM Global have recently announced a 5% premium reduction to incentivize resilient design. California is another great example that just announced a new policy that is mandating insurance discounts for specific measures that reduce wildfire risk. So we're starting to see some momentum, which I think is really exciting, and I would love to see the insurance begin to offer longer policies, longer term policies that might give our developers a little more assurance and further push them to design with resilience in mind.
Yeah, you think because seems like there's a longer term view when you're taking resilience into account, right? And that's a longer term payback period that you're looking at. So for your insurance to reset every year, those incentives aren't really aligned, right, necessarily. So I think that is interesting. If there's some, again, you're always looking at, is it a carrot or a stick that's going to make the action happen? It sounds like there's maybe some regulatory sticks and maybe some private market carrots that will help get that along. So that is interesting to see if there will be more of an alignment of time horizon with those, because a lot of these measures are probably, from the real estate owner's perspective, much longer time horizon than a 1-year return or a 1-year decision, right?
Well, and when you look at the protection that insurance is meant to provide, if that insurance policy is also encouraging above code design, then that does more than just financial protection, because insurers will protect your initial investment. It won't protect your return, right? It's there to help you recover from damage. And that's not going to help your building value if it plummets.
Right. And then finally, switching gears here a little bit, the work that you've done with First Street Foundation, that ULI helped them build or research some of the data for their Risk Factor Pro tool. So tell us a little bit about the work that you've done there.
Yeah, so that was an interesting collaboration for us. ULI really sees a need to bring together climate risk analytic software industry partners and the real estate industry to help to refine the tools that are available and just make the outputs more relevant and more actionable for real estate. Real estate professionals are not typically climate scientists, and climate scientists don't often understand the business of real estate. So it was a nice opportunity to bring these two sides together and hopefully make them both stronger. The collaboration with First Street was, I would say, a first foray for ULI into working more deeply with climate risk software developers. And we were able to hold a series of focus groups where ULI members informed essentially the user interface. So First Street Foundation did all the back-end data, climate risk, analytic stuff, and we helped them better communicate that to the real estate industry. And they integrated a lot of ULI member feedback. They have the opportunity to analyze past, present, and future risk at the asset and at the market scale. They're estimating building-specific damage and downtime. You can see how that could be helpful to real estate. And then there's interactive hazard layers for flood and wildfire and extreme heat, as well as individual asset analysis and aggregate portfolio reviews. So we really enjoyed that opportunity to make a tool better, and we would love to continue to do work like that. And what I think our ULI members will benefit from more broadly is the discount that First Street Foundation is offering to ULI members in appreciation for our help. They are offering 5 free report downloads to all ULI members.
Perfect. And again, we'll have links in the show notes for all these resources. So I guess along that line of creating a standardized language and methodologies against all these different reports and different service providers, where does ULI see their role in that? And then as owners and practitioners, what's their role in that?
I think ULI has a strength in being a convener, right? We're a big tent organization. We have everyone from architects, engineers, and lawyers all the way up through developers, investors, and city officials. And I would love to see us bring together the real estate industry and the climate risk analytics software industry to talk about the emerging standards and how we can be more transparent in what we're doing so that we have better outcomes. Because each firm is going to have their own needs. They're unique, right? It depends on what you're investing in, what your time horizons are, what your risk tolerance is. And so they might be best served by tool A or tool B or tool C or maybe even a combination of tools. But the more that we refine each of these tools and make them easier to use and more applicable, the greater uptake we'll see, which ultimately translates to reducing risk, preserving value, and just creating a more resilient future.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great spot to wrap it up. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for spending your time with us. Why don't you tell the listeners how they can learn more about what you're up to at ULI?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. You can learn more about the Urban Resilience Program at uli.org/resilience.
Perfect. Have a great rest of the fall meeting.
Thank you.
Elena, thank you so much for spending some time with us at the fall meeting. Why don't you start, tell us a little bit about your work with LaSalle and what your panel was about today.
Sure. So I'm the LaSalle head of sustainability for the Americas region. We've got about $30 billion of assets under management across all asset classes. So office, retail, multifamily, industrial, single-family homes, some more unusual asset classes you might not have heard of. And in my role, I work really closely with portfolio management, acquisitions, and asset management on all things sustainability and climate risk. So that goes from the high-level setting of goals and strategy to developing resources, updating our processes like acquisitions and due diligence process, and then actually getting things done at the assets. So, implementing energy efficiency and climate risk hardening improvements.
And so your panel today was how to choose, use, and better understand climate risk analytics. What does that mean in practicality? What are some of the analytics that you're looking at, and then how is that affecting your investment decisions?
Sure. So we went through a pretty protracted process of assessing climate risk analytics providers over the past couple years and saw that a lot of our peers were running into the same challenges. And so that's why we wanted to really bring the conversation out into the open, and so the whole industry could benefit from this and not be reinventing the wheel or struggling with the same questions themselves. So, we're trying to just get a handle on what is the physical risk of different climate events of our assets, floods, hurricanes, as well as chronic events like, heat waves and things like that. So we went through a big process. We assessed a bunch of climate risk providers. We ended up selecting one main one with some others as supplements. But what we saw was a lot of inconsistency in how the analysis is being approached. So, the baseline assumptions, how the models are done, which hazards are included. The one example I like to give that I think makes it really clear is one provider that we looked at included existing risk, and another provider did not include existing risk. And because of that, the second provider didn't flag any of our Florida assets for hurricane risk.
Which seems
It's crazy.
fairly non-intuitive.
Right. So you look
Right.
at these results and you're like, wait a second, how come all of our assets in like Baltimore and New York and Boston are getting flagged for hurricanes,
Right.
but our assets in Florida are not?
Right.
And their answer was, oh, well, we only look at forward-looking change in risk.
Yeah.
We just assume that all of the existing risk is already priced in today.
Got it.
Which you could have a debate about that.
Yeah.
But also, if you didn't know that and understand your provider's
Sure.
methodology, you might make the wrong conclusions. Or if you're an investor and you're getting climate risk analysis from different investment managers who are using different climate risk providers, one portfolio could show up as being much higher risk because they're including baseline risk, where
Right.
another portfolio is not. And so you would get misleading results comparing those two portfolios just because of the differences in the methodology.
Yeah, that was one thing that you mentioned on the panel too, was creating we're all generally speaking a similar language, but getting some of these terms a little bit better defined, so we're all kind of speaking from the same, playing from the same deck, if you will. And to that, so you mentioned physical risk and then transition risk.
Yep.
What are the differences between those two risks?
So I think when a lot of people think about climate change, they're thinking about physical risk, right? And that's the planet is warming. That's leading to more extreme heat and cold, water-related hazards like increased frequency and intensity of rain and snow, and more droughts in other places, coastal flooding, hurricanes, landslides, like that's all the physical climate risk. And then the transition risk is all of the regulatory and market and technology changes that are happening as a result of the physical risk. So increased regulations in cities for building energy performance or for climate hardening, changes in tenant and investor demand, changes in technologies of ways of constructing buildings or different systems that you're using in buildings. So those all have, costs associated as well.
And so you mentioned also these first pass analyses are kind of like the flag to maybe ask more questions. And then once you've identified those risks, how are those currently being, you mentioned maybe they're being priced in, maybe they're not. How are you actually taking these analytics and these risks that you're discovering? Are you underwriting those differently? Are you including those as CapEx down the road? Like, how does that look at from a capitalization and just underwriting perspective?
Yeah. So at this point, it is in every deal memo for new acquisitions for us. We've also done a portfolio level analysis where we've identified a small number of our existing assets that are high risk, and we're needing to dig in more on those. As you mentioned, no one can predict what's going to happen with the climate to like the second or third decimal point and say like exactly in what year it's going to happen or whatever, right? And so, it really is a matter of flagging high, medium, low. We need to take a closer look at this asset. Also, the climate risk analysis is often looking at a physical location, like a spot on a map, but not necessarily looking at the physical construction of the building. So once you start digging in, you could say, oh, look, like the HVAC system is actually on the roof instead of in the basement, or they elevated the site. There could actually be information that you find out about the building that makes it less at risk, or you dig in and you say, okay, they need a flood barrier, or, you have more severe concerns that's going to need like major hardening. So, what intervention is needed really depends on how severe we think the risk is, but it is something that we're looking at acquisitions. We have definitely passed on a couple of deals where when we considered the level of hardening that would be needed, it no longer penciled for us, and so we didn't pursue that deal. And then we do have a handful of properties where we're digging in on what might need to be done at that property. And then going forward, it really becomes just another factor that is part of overall risk management and diversification in a portfolio. You're not going to have zero risk, but you might want to geographically diversify, not have all your assets in the same place in Florida, or sort of think about it overall from that perspective. And
then you mentioned also when you're acquiring an asset, you're looking at the next buyer's exit. So you're looking at this, not just your exit, but the person that buys this, how is this going to affect their ability to exit? Because that's obviously going to play in the same decisions you're making now on the buy.
Yeah.
That's a really long-term horizon, right? So how are you able to price that in today? Is it more of just this kind of, is this more of an art still? Are we getting to where it's more of a science? Like, how do you actually consider the buyer's exit 20 years from now when you're acquiring something today? That seems like a pretty tall task.
Yeah, I think a lot of real estate underwriting requires using many assumptions and being as informed as you can about them, and having the best sort of error bands and sensitivity tests and things like that. So, you have to know that any assumption in your underwriting is not exactly what's going to happen, right? But in terms of the next buyer's exit, we're thinking about that because when we sell the property in, say, 10 years, the buyer of the property is thinking about how they're going to sell the property in 10 years. And so all of that sort of collapses all that time into today's value. And so we are personally not changing our exit cap rates, but we saw in the interviews that were done for the ULI paper that some of our peers are starting to consider it as something that would influence exit caps. For us, it's more a matter of I guess it's a little more subjective in terms of we're looking at how high risk the asset is. We're looking at what could be done to mitigate physically the asset and putting that into CapEx or just into our overall decision of whether it's a good asset to acquire.
Yeah, and we'll have links in the show notes to the paper that you guys
Yep.
published. So definitely recommend clicking on that and reading it. And then you mentioned also positive density in certain markets, right, where there's so much real estate value to protect. Again, it seems very like a Herculean effort to try to actually quantify some of these things, right? I mean, that seems like a challenge. And so I guess when you're looking at different markets that have more, like you said, you mentioned Manhattan, right? That's naturally going to be protected. Whereas you look at some of the other coastal markets where maybe there isn't as much property value. How is that affecting your decisions today? It sounds like you guys are very proactive in terms of considering these things, whereas maybe some aren't as proactive about this. So where do you see that in your decision making today? And then where does that go from here?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the next frontier for us. So we talked about when you dig in at it, if you identify an asset's higher risk, you have to dig in on the physical condition of that asset. And the other thing you have to really look at is what's going on in the market and the infrastructure. Because if you have a perfectly hardened asset, but there's no electricity and no one can get to it, your
That makes it
tenants
challenging.
are still not going to be paying
Right.
rent.
Yeah.
So you have to think about that market level infrastructure question as well. We kind of have a theory that when there is really high concentration of real estate value, like in Lower Manhattan or the Boston waterfront, it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't take action to protect those assets. But it is still a little bit of a subjective decision of like, okay, are they going to have the political will
Right.
to get the projects approved, and like, where's the money
Where's the
coming
money coming from?
from?
Yeah, tax base, yeah.
Is that going to be all real estate taxes paying
Yeah,
for that?
yeah.
I think when we did the analysis in Europe, the Netherlands comes up as, the Netherlands is going to get totally wiped out. And I think everyone who's in that market would debate you hotly on that because they have so much plans in place to build infrastructure to protect the real estate there. So I think that's, again, where you have to really kind of make your own call about what you think is going to happen in that market.
Yeah, it's a lot of, you have to have a crystal ball a little bit, right? And just kind of make the best with the data that you can have. And again, I think that's what's so interesting about the report. As you kind of think about bringing that back to real estate managers that maybe aren't as proactive, they're not as in tune with this, what are some of the steps that they might be able to take to start getting better educated about these climate risks and some of the analytics that maybe you're looking at or could be available for managers to start considering this in their investment decisions?
Yeah, so I think just get started. There's a little bit of this, it's so complex, let's just not even do it. But it is a real risk. Climate.
It's a now risk, right? It's
Yeah,
not
it's
not
already
a
happening.
30-year risk. It's like it's now. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And physical climate events are already happening today, as we recently saw in Florida,
Yeah.
as we've seen on the New York, New Jersey coast recently. So you have to consider it.
Yeah.
None of these providers are perfect, but they're all pretty good and they're all way better than nothing, so it really is a matter of like, just get started, start taking a look at the data, start getting familiar with it. And I think one of the things the report does a good job of is the last couple pages of the report summarize some questions to ask to make sure you understand the approach of your provider. So whoever you use, there's like sort of 5 questions in terms of, what are the scenarios they're using? What hazards are they including? Do they include baseline risk? Do they include planned market level infrastructure? Things like that, where you can just kind of get a handle on what you're looking at and really seeing it more as a flag. It's not going to give you the perfect accuracy crystal ball,
right.
but it is going to tell you, some
Where to ask more questions.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's going to highlight some physical locations and markets. You need to look in this area for this kind of risk and start paying attention to it there.
So that sounds like a great place to start. Go to the show notes and download the report.
Yeah.
Yeah, easy enough. Elena, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Fascinating topic. Like I said, we could probably talk for hours on this. Had to keep a little bit brief, but we appreciate you coming and sharing with us today. So why don't you let the listeners know how they can learn more about what you're up to with LaSalle?
Sure. Well, this is an evolving topic. So definitely follow us on social media. We're pretty active on LinkedIn, posting whenever we have new stuff coming out.
Perfect. Well, thank you again and enjoy the rest of the fall meeting.
Thanks.